And my guest is James D. Eugenio, who has written the foreword to the book JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia by Dr. Greg Polgrain. This book is available at Skyhorse Publishing. James is a longtime researcher and historian on the Kennedy assassination. James, thanks for joining me as always.
Sure. I did you say I wrote the foreword for Greg's book?
No, the after you wrote the afterword to it.
Right. Okay. It's the longest afterword I've ever written. It's like 15
Okay.
pages.
Now, you're a longtime student of the Kennedy assassination. There actually has been some new information that's just come out recently regarding the Zapruder film or some other films that showed that there were more than multiple shots that went off that day. But I want to talk more here specifically about the theories covered in this book and the relationship between JFK and Allen Dulles, whose brother, Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration. He was the founder of the CIA. Their father was a high-level government official, I think a Secretary of State in the Cleveland administration. I mean, this is a family that goes back in American establishment history. So what's the deal with Allen Dulles? I mean, how did he get started there, and what was his relationship with Kennedy?
The Dulles family, as you just mentioned, goes way back in history to the turn of the century. All right. I believe his great uncle was involved in the Wilson administration.
Well, Robert Lansing, yeah.
Lansing, right. Okay. All right. And what happened is that they had in the family this close relationship between religion and politics. Okay. And of course, it was the Christianity, all right, as was the religion. And so
Right.
it's their idea that, sort of like bearing the white man's burden, that a whole Rudyard Kipling motto. Okay. And that this
Yes.
is what we're going to do. Now, this was complicated by the fact that John Foster Dulles became the managing partner at Sullivan and Cromwell.
Oh, yeah, which is one of Washington's the biggest insider law firms.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The giant law firm in New York City.
Yes.
Which I believe at the time that he was there, which was the 20s, and it might have even been before that, he went up the ladder, but he actually joined the firm in like 1913 or something like that. And then he went up the ladder, became a senior partner or managing partner. At that time, I'm pretty sure Sullivan and Cromwell was the number one international corporate law firm, in America. And so what happened is that you had Sullivan and Cromwell representing all of these colossal corporations, which of course had a large reliance upon third world natural resources, that they could get cheap because of colonialism, all right, and the backwardness of those societies that had been kept that way by their colonial masters.
Yep.
Generally speaking, at that time, the major powers overseas were like England, France, Belgium, to a lesser extent, Belgium and the Netherlands. Belgium in the Congo, the Netherlands in Indonesia. Okay. And so they had a vested interest in keeping that status quo. Now, we mentioned Congo.
Right.
Well, Allen Dulles, of course, went into the CIA. He was actually in the OSS during the 1940s, and he operated out of Bern, Switzerland. He was one of the major officers in the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. So he was a very experienced espionage operator, okay, by the time he got into World War II. He had been a senior partner at Sullivan Cromwell, where his brother was the managing partner. All right. And so once the war was over, Dulles was one of the guys, along with Raymond Donovan, who were determined to keep the OSS going during peacetime. And so they performed a kind of lobbying effort to get Truman to pass the National Security Act, which included the creation of the CIA. Right. And then
Right.
when Eisenhower was elected, I think it was even before that, he became very good friends with John Foster Dulles. All right. And so
Yes.
when Dulles went into the administration as the Secretary of State, he brought in his brother. Okay. And he was deputy director. And then he replaced Walter Bedell Smith as director of the CIA. And it was under Allen Dulles that the CIA began to morph over from an intelligence gathering organization to a more of a covert action regime change organization.
Right. Let me just give a little background from what I know as well. During the Eisenhower administration, John Foster Dulles, working with his brother, were able to sort of intervene in nations around the world in a very imperialistic way, kind of the old the Anglophile approach. You know, they were involved in a coup in Iran against Mossadegh. They were involved in a coup in Guatemala against Arbenz. They were involved in the coup in the Congo against Patrice Lumumba. They were involved really not just because of this kind of Anglo-American vision that originally had been articulated by Cecil Rhodes, but also they represented major corporations like, the United Fruit in the case of Guatemala, and British Oil, BP, in the case of Iran. And they kind of wanted to maintain and expand this sort of informal world colonialism without the name. And they were very much part of that old way of thinking about things. I mean, this perpetual war for perpetual peace position.
That's all true. That's
Yeah.
all pretty much, the way that it worked. All right. And what happened is that you left out one. They tried to throw Sukarno in 19.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay. And in fact, that operation against Sukarno in 1958 was the largest CIA operation before the Bay of Pigs.
And it failed.
And it failed. But it was a huge operation, okay, that went on for months and months and months. And then what happened is Sukarno was always insisting that this is not an innate or indigenous rebellion. This is brought on by the United States and the CIA. And then what happened is they shot down a CIA pilot, and he lived, and this became their evidence.
Right.
I told you this is a CIA operation.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of turned the tide. And that's when the Dulles brothers decided we better wind this thing down. Okay, we don't want to expose ourselves any more than we already have. All right. Okay,
Right.
so when Kennedy came into office, he decided that he wanted to try and mend fences with Sukarno. All right.
Right. And also, if I might just interject here as well, they already had the operation on the books to take out Fidel Castro. But putting that aside, generally speaking, Kennedy was not of the ilk that believed in this idea of perpetual war. He was in a way, he was like Trump in that way. He wanted to put America's interests first. In fact, Kennedy, people may not know this, but Kennedy actually ran on a very similar slogan to Trump: make our nation great again. was the slogan. And he did not. He wanted the United States to not intervene and not meddle into the affairs of countries around the world. And that, of course, ran against the Dulles brothers in the same way that Trump's position ran against some of the, the neocon establishment that he had to confront.
See, what you're bringing up here goes back to 1955 and the first meeting of what was then called the non-aligned movement. Okay, and this was held in Indonesia at the city of Bandung, and Sukarno was the host. And what this did is it grouped together leaders of the third world, like Nasser, okay, like Nehru, okay,
Yep.
and they were very much worried about what had happened in 1953, okay, in what we mentioned as the overthrow of Mossadegh.
Yes.
Right. And in 1954, the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so they wanted to stay neutral amid, they did not understand why they could not choose their own path, okay, between these two edges of the Cold War. You know, if they wanted to trade with somebody, they should be able to trade with somebody. If we wanted to get arms from somebody, let's get arms from somebody. Okay, we should be able to free our own choices up and not be tinged, okay, as being part of the Red Menace, okay, if we chose to do that. And so that's what that meeting was about. Now, John Foster Dulles, for him, this was not possible. There was no such thing as neutralism.
Right.
The Cold War. You were either for us or against us. All right. And a good example of how this was with Nasser. When John Foster Dulles wanted him to join the Baghdad Pact, all right, which eventually became CENTO, the Middle East acronym, for this treaty.
Kind of a Middle East version of NATO.
Right.
It was a military alliance.
So Nasser said, I can't join this Baghdad Pact. Okay, I mean, your silent partner in this is going to be England. England is the biggest colonizing country in the world. My whole appeal to my people is that we're independent. Okay, we're free. We're not going to be part of this whole Cold War. They would look at me as if I'm just a fraud. Okay, joined up in this thing. And Dulles was really, really angry that Nasser said this. And so he ended up cutting the funding for the Aswan Dam. All right. Okay. And so that Nasser did the only thing he could do is when they backed out, he went to Russia and got the money for the Aswan Dam. All right. And so Kennedy, who was a senator at the time, he thought this was really stupid. Okay. He said, what are you doing? You're giving them no choice but to go to Moscow. Okay. Isn't it better to have him on our side, even though he wants to be neutral, than have him go to Nikita Khrushchev to get the money to complete the Aswan Dam? All right. And so this is one of the things, this is one of the beefs he had with Eisenhower and Dulles. And so this is one of the reasons why with Kennedy, he didn't look at neutralism as being evil or being okay. He thought very logically, I believe, is that look, we can compete with the Soviet Union and the third world peacefully because we have a bigger and a better economy. Therefore, we can offer these people more than Moscow can. So that's the path we should take. Let's not discourage neutralism. Let's compete for these people. Okay. And this is what he tried to do.
Right. And also, I mean, Kennedy, within a month or two after taking office, of course, he had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which was dropped into his lap by Allen Dulles, head of the CIA.
It was
And I think that they were angry at him for not going all the way with that.
right. See, what they had misled him. I mean, there's been a lot of people written about this,
Right.
but in general terms, they had misled him as to the possibility, the success of the operation, the fact that there were going to be people who would desert Castro the minute these exiles landed on the beach, okay, and that it would be a total surprise to the Cubans that they were landing there. Well, that was all a bunch of baloney, okay,
Sure.
and Allen Dulles himself later confessed in these papers that were found at the Princeton Library, okay,
Mhm.
that he did not think the operation would be a success, but he thought that when Kennedy faced with failure, the crumbling of the operation, he would go ahead and send in the Navy and the Marines, which just happened to be right off the coast there in the Caribbean Sea, all right, to salvage the operation, all
Right,
right.
which he didn't do.
And so Kennedy and his brother, when they did their investigation of the Bay of Pigs, this is what Bobby Kennedy found out. Okay,
Mhm.
he concluded that they knew this thing was going to fail and that they thought that his brother, that they would be able to take advantage of him in this moment of defeat to get what they really wanted. All right. And so he told his brother that this happened, that this is the way it happened. Okay. And so that is when JFK decided that the whole top of the CIA had to go. You know, Dulles, Bissell, and
Mhm. He
Cabell.
he famously made the quote that he would smash it into 1,000 pieces.
Right. And by the way, one last example about that. Bobby Kennedy was so angry about this when he found out about it. After his brother had fired those three people, he called in Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and said, "Do we have any other member of the Dulles family working in this administration?" Dean
Oh,
Rusk
boy.
said,
Yeah.
"Yes,
They really wanted to purge them.
his sister works at the State Department." And
Ah,
Bobby said, "I want her fired too. I don't
okay.
want any member of the Dulles family in this administration."
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it really turned into almost personal. But then there were two other events I think that I don't know if Alan Dulles had any behind the scenes involvement in, because after all, these types of people never go away. I mean, they have power and they hold on to power for their entire life. I mean, John Foster had already died under Eisenhower, but Alan Dulles was still a very powerful figure, and that was the um, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I have read that the generals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor, and some of these other guys, they wanted Kennedy to go to war against Russia. I mean, they wanted like a real military confrontation. And the fact that Kennedy was able to diffuse the situation behind the scenes by making a deal with Khrushchev, and essentially that the Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba, and that the United States removed some missiles from Turkey and I guess Italy, that they were pretty angry about that. They felt betrayed, and they felt that Kennedy, followed up their agenda for war, kind of like what we have now with Ukraine, quite frankly. It's a lot of money to be made, billions of dollars sifting through the hands of various shadowy groups and oligarchs. War is profitable. I mean, the international establishment learned this, particularly after World War One, when you had fortunes made. And also, it feeds into this agenda of internationalism and perpetual war. So they were pretty angry about that. And then, of course, Vietnam, it's generally been said that Kennedy wanted to de escalate Vietnam, and that 2 weeks before the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnamese prime minister, who, by the way, happened to be Catholic, was murdered brutally, and his body was, put into the back of a trunk along with his brother. and that this might have been some kind of a CIA involvement. Kennedy was extremely distraught when he heard about it. And I'm wondering, did those two events play any role in this? What is it? Was Alan Dulles involved in? Is there any evidence that he had any hand in those things?
Well, by this time, Alan Dulles has been retired, but as
Uh,
David Talbot wrote in his book, The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles was only retired for, uh, as they say, uh, it was only technical. He was still meeting
yes.
these guys.
Oh
Okay,
yeah.
he was still meeting with these guys, so he was probably right up to date with this. Let's take
Sure.
the crisis that you mentioned. Everybody in the Pentagon wanted to either invade or bomb the missile silos. All right, there was no exception to that in the
Right.
Pentagon.
Hmm.
All the guys did. All right, they were very upset, to put it mildly, when Kennedy decided to find a negotiated way out of this very, very serious problem. All right.
Indeed.
They looked at it this way. Look, we blew it at the Bay of Pigs. Now we have the perfect opportunity to go into Cuba and knock this guy off. Okay. And nobody would blame us for it. See, what they didn't know, and this didn't come out till later, what they didn't know is that the Russians had given Castro two sets of nuclear missiles, okay, tactical ones. One was short range, 15 to 25 miles, and the other one was longer range, about 80 to 90 miles. So any invasion force that would have crossed the straits there to invade would have been incinerated, okay? And what what would Kennedy have, what choice would
Yeah.
he
What
have?
do we need to have a nuclear cloud over Florida? I mean, it would have been insane. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so this is how bad this thing got. And so Kennedy did what I believe, I think what most national people believe, was the best alternative he had, which was a negotiated settlement to get the missiles out. And then we would take our missiles out of Turkey. All right. And then we would also make a pledge not to invade the island. All right. Now, as you mentioned, Kennedy's chief negotiator on this was his brother.
Hmm.
He had to go around the committee that was in the White House, all right, and he sent his brother to meet Dobrynin, who was the Russian ambassador in Washington, and they hammered out the final parts of this truce between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Now, the other
Hmm.
situation you're talking about that's going on a few months later is in Saigon, okay,
Indeed.
in Vietnam, Indochina. And in that one, Kennedy had determined that Vietnam was not a security interest of the United States. This country 9,000 miles away was not a security interest of the United States.
Right.
And B, it was next to impossible to win a war there on the ground because MacArthur had told him, okay, General MacArthur had told him, look, unless you're ready to commit 1,000,000 troops for like 10 years, okay, then don't do it because it's not worth it. All right. Okay. And now there's a guy who should know. All right.
Indeed.
De
Yeah.
Gaulle told him the same thing. All right. Because, France had been through this colonial war in Indochina also.
That's right.
And so this is what Kennedy had decided by 1962, that he wasn't going to go in to Vietnam. Then in 1963, he sent McNamara to begin a plan to withdraw our advisors there. All right, and this was solidified, I believe, in May of 1963. All right, at a meeting in Hawaii. All right, where McNamara requested withdrawal schedules. from all the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department stationed in Vietnam. And then he got them and he looked at them and he said, this is too slow. They have to be speeded up. All right. And so this began the withdrawal plan, which was written into I think it's NSAM 263. All right, which said the first 1,000 troops would return at the end of December 1963, and then there would be 1,000 advisors, and then 1,000 advisors a month until it's completed in 1965. Now, as you mentioned, there was another factor that helped Kennedy make up his mind about this. In May of 1963, there was a horrendous outbreak of violence in the city of Hue, all right, which I believe is in the northern part of South Vietnam.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Buddhists believed that they were being discriminated against, all right, and they started a strike or a religious protest.
This was the one with the picture that made its way around the world with the monk immolating himself in gasoline.
I'm going to get to that. It started in May in Hue, though. All right. Okay. And Diem and his brother made a terrible mistake, and they ended up firing into the crowd. And I think there was something like 6 or 7 people killed, 13 wounded, and 2 kids were crushed, okay, underneath a truck. Right. And this was about the worst thing they could have done.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
This only exasperated a bad situation instead of diffusing it. And then, as you said, 1 month later, as it spread south to Saigon, there was this famous incident on the streets of Saigon where a Buddhist monk had alerted the media to come to this square to get a film or a photograph of something very big that was going to happen. And then what happened is he had an assistant pour gasoline on him and then throw a match, and he immolated himself. And this was captured by film cameras, by made
its way around the world, all over.
Yeah. And Kennedy couldn't believe it when he saw it. He goes, "My God, what are we doing here with this guy?" And now, what most people don't understand, that was not an isolated incident.
Right.
It happened 8 more times, okay? And one of them was a nun who immolated herself.
Mm.
And so Kennedy decided that, and most of the people in the State Department also, that this was going to be an impossible government to support, okay? Because, they're basically, this was the big problem. Diem was a Catholic, okay?
Indeed.
70% of the people in Vietnam were Buddhists, okay? So this was a very, very serious problem, because what you were doing here, of course, is you were oppressing the majority, and that was just like an impossible situation, all right? And so this is another reason why Kennedy decided we have to get out of this situation here, all right? Now, the what you're talking about, the deaths of Diem and New, this is something that Kennedy understood by about August of 63, when the CIA pulled the credits for the Export-Import Bank in Saigon without telling him, okay? And he said, "What are you doing? Who told you to do that?" And the CIA guy at the meeting said, "We do it automatically at a certain point." And he said words to the effect, "My God, you know what you've done?" Okay, and so Kennedy realized, so he actually tried to get Diem and New out.
Mm.
He sent his friend, Torrey McDonald, to Saigon, okay, to try and convince them to get out of the country, because he knew that there was going to be something very, very horrible that was going to happen, okay? Right. And so when the military coup took place, Lodge, who was the ambassador.
Yes, Henry Cabot Lodge. Mm-hmm.
Right. He kept on calling, Jim kept on calling him, and as he was trying to escape. Lodge was in cahoots with Comine, who was the de facto station chief of the CIA there. He was a guy in contact with the generals. And so, of course, what happened is that every time Diem would call Lodge, Lodge would call Comine. So this is how Diem could not escape. Okay. And Kennedy was really, really upset at this. Okay. And he recalled Lodge for the purpose of firing him. All right. But what happened is Kennedy was killed and Johnson took over Vietnam policy and he kept Lodge.
Well, not only that, but I mean, Kennedy was killed like within a few weeks after Diem was assassinated. And the minute Johnson got into office, like I think within 24 hours, he started to escalate the war in Vietnam. But I want to get to the business of Indonesia because that's the topic of the book we're discussing, JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia. Now, at the time of Kennedy, you had Sukarno was pretty much in power. He was a strong man there, but the Dutch continued to control Western New Guinea. They hadn't quite surrendered that yet. That would come, I think, about 10 years later. They continue to hold on to that one piece. And there was a lot of rumors that piece of land had, I think it was oil or gold, or it had some enormous resource. There was also the situation, by the way, I'll do this briefly, where one of the Rockefeller sons, Michael Rockefeller, was on an expedition there and he disappeared. Now, in the interior of Western New Guinea. Now, Western New Guinea was a very primitive place. We're talking about people who were still apparently involved with cannibalism, and in some cases, apparently they still are. You know, this is a very remote area. I saw a picture actually recently that emerged where someone took a snapshot of the natives on the interior part of that island. And there were these 4 or 5 guys paddling on a kind of a canoe-like boat. And one of the guys was clearly white and looked like he possibly could have been Rockefeller. And that what might have happened is that Rockefeller was captured and he sort of, he became native. It was sort of like a Stockholm syndrome, I guess. And so, that's a possibility, but that we're going to sidebar here. What was the deal then with Dutch Indonesia, Dutch New Guinea, and the Dulles brothers and Kennedy?
Okay, this is very, very interesting topic that it's, I believe, too much ignored. All right, because like you said, this part of Indonesia, which really wasn't a part of Indonesia, the Netherlands wanted to hold on to it.
Yeah.
It was probably the most extraordinarily rich, small area in the whole surface of the globe. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. It had tremendous deposits of copper, silver, gold, and petroleum. All right. And in fact, these 2 areas we're talking about, called the Erzberg, was one of them. Okay. They probably had the highest concentration of gold, okay, that the world has ever seen any place. All right. That's how incredibly rich they were. You're talking not tens of millions, not
this
hundreds.
Is like a mother lode that would make anything in the United States look puny.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah, sure.
All right. That's how rich Copper Mountain was. All right. Now, very, 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 very few people knew about this. But Allen Dulles was one of the people who did, because he did Sullivan and Cromwell when the first expedition went out to explore Copper Mountain. Okay. All right. And he found out through the Dutch study just how incredibly wealthy this area was. All right. Because at Sullivan and Cromwell, he was the Rockefeller's guy. Okay. And the Rockefellers, of course, were very interested, in the Erzberg. Okay. And so he was one of the very few people who knew about it. The people at the top in the Netherlands also knew about it. But Sukarno and Kennedy didn't know about it. All right. So after the revolution, when Sukarno leads the Indonesian people to its anti-colonial victory over the Netherlands, they did not want to give up New Guinea.
Right.
All right.
Sure.
But they wouldn't tell them why. Okay.
They just wanted to hold on to it. Right. And they did hold on to it for right
Yeah.
up till, I think, 1970.
All right. So when they won their freedom, okay, from the Netherlands kept this area. And
Yes.
Arnold didn't like it. He didn't know why, what was there, but he just felt that that should be a part of Indonesia,
Sure.
right? So when he meets Kennedy in 1961, they bring this topic up during their discussions, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So Kennedy believes that in order to have good relations with Sukarno, he wants to do two things, all right? He wants to, number one, get back Alan Pope, who is the CIA pilot who was shot down during the 1958 rebellion. Okay. And in return, he will negotiate New Guinea from the Netherlands and give it to Sukarno. All right.
Sure.
So he sends his brother, Bobby Kennedy, to negotiate what's called the New York Agreement. All right. And this is what happens. Okay. Sukarno gets this area. All right. And Alan Pope is returned. All right. To the United States.
But that must have really stepped on the toes of Allen Dulles and
Right.
his people. Yeah.
Kennedy doesn't know, and that's a very good point you brought up, is that he's beginning to play into the hands of Allen Dulles. Okay. Because first of all, Netherlands now is out of the picture.
Right.
Okay? And so he's already started one rebellion against Sukarno,
which failed
in 1958. And so he'll be a little bit better organized this time around. All right. So now all he needs to do is overthrow Sukarno for real. And this incredible amount of wealth will now go to his clients up at Sullivan and Cromwell. Mm-hmm. And this is the main thesis of Greg Pulgrain's book. Okay, right. Background Indonesia, JFK versus Allen Dulles. Okay, mm-hmm. He believes that Allen Dulles was more or less planning this whole thing for years behind the scenes. Okay, all right, because he, like we said earlier, he was one of the very, very few people who knew just how rich the Copper Mountain really was.
Right, sure. So, what? By the way, what? Just as a little sidebar here, who ended up? Did anybody? Were those riches ever mined and exploited? I mean, where are they today?
You mean the mines? The mines?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Freeport Sulphur. Freeport Sulphur was at that time had just been kicked out of Cuba. All right, mm-hmm. And they were looking to reinvest. And one of their chief engineers discovered the Dutch study, all right, which was made in the 30s. And he looked at it and he said, this looks very interesting, all right? And Freeport Sulphur was a mining company, all right? Sulphur was one of their big ones, but they also did other kinds of mining. So he brought it to his superiors, all right? And they said, okay, we'll go ahead and we'll do a more up-to-date expedition. So he went over there and he went over to the Copper Mountain and he said, it's true, except I believe there's a lot more gold there than this Dutch study said there was. Okay. In fact, I believe there's more value in gold and silver than there is in copper. All right. Okay. And so they had this, I think this was in 1964. All right. When Freeport Sulphur did this. So they had a problem. They now know that all of this incredible wealth is there. But
Okay, so
Sukarno,
it became known. So
okay,
then Sukarno is overthrown in 65 by Suharto.
now this is a very, very, very interesting subject,
Yeah.
right? Because there was a cable that was discovered, I believe, in a Scandinavian country in an archive, in which it said words of the effect that something like this, and this isn't verbatim, this is
Mhm.
the gist of what the cable said. CIA is planning a plot for Indonesia in which Sukarno will fall more or less of his own weight, and Indonesia will be up for grabs once this happens. That's in 64.
Okay.
Remember, the year before it happened.
Before it happened, yeah.
Yeah, right. So, in other words, there's evidence that this was in the planning stages about a year before it actually occurred. Right. And so, as this, and I'm really glad that Oliver Stone put this in the long version of his film JFK Destiny Betrayed. That
Mhm.
he had one of the experts on this subject, Bradley Simpson, who's a professor at the University of Connecticut. And he actually says to Oliver that if there's no Kennedy assassination, what happened in Indonesia in 1965 would not have happened. This was one of the most brutal, bloody. Well, let me make this clear. I believe it is the most brutal and bloody CIA coup in the whole history of that organization.
Yeah.
Because the low estimates, and when I say low, I'm being conservative. Okay, the low estimates are that 500,000 people were killed. Okay, during the overthrow from Sukarno to Suharto. Other estimates go higher than that. Okay,
Right. And
and
also Suharto was one of the most brutal dictators. He
yeah,
almost committed almost genocide in East Timor and seizing it from the Portuguese. I think that Suharto also was able to take over Dutch New Guinea, and it was just an absolute horror. I mean, that regime.
see, the thing is, Suharto essentially wiped out what was called the PKI. The PKI was the Indonesian Communist Party.
Yes.
Outside of Russia, outside of China, it was probably the most sizable communist party that there was in the world. I believe about like 19% of the electorate in Indonesia were members of the PKI. And
Mhm.
Sukarno understood, look, he told Kennedy, you know, these are a bunch of farmers, self sustaining farmers. These are not apparatchiks from Moscow.
Right.
These are people who don't have anything and who are trying to work their way out of poverty. All right. And so there's nothing really dangerous about them. And you know that I'm not a communist. All right. So there really isn't anything to be worried about in that aspect. But the CIA didn't look at it that way.
Mhm.
All right. They looked at this as some kind of dangerous communist party and Sukarno as some kind of, red. All right. Okay. And they decided that they were going to do away with this and install what is essentially a military dictator. Okay.
Right.
Which is what Suharto really was. Now, this went on, okay, for this massacre of the PKI went on for over a year, all right, until finally Sukarno was essentially sidelined. He was deposed, all right. He was complete. He was a figurehead from about late 1965 through 66, and finally Suharto took formal power in 1967. And do you know the first contract that he signed? Do you remember?
Probably with not Sullivan and Cromwell, but with the sulfur company.
Or sulfur. The
Yeah,
first contract,
represented by Sullivan and Cromwell.
right? The
So
first
they got a nice cut.
time. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's in Greg's book. I think he has a picture of it, the signing
Okay.
in his book. Now,
So then the whole thing was turned over to these guys who basically set Suharto up to take over the government in such a brutal way.
right.
And I think that what and the connection between that and the Kennedy assassination, that's not a firm connection, but as you say, James, it wouldn't have happened had Kennedy been president. So there's some circumstantial elements to it.
Yes, and let me explain why I believe this is so.
Yeah.
When Kennedy in 1963, he was advising Sukarno about foreign investments in Indonesia, and he actually sent over 3 trade representatives from Tufts University. Okay, and he advised them before they left. He said, "Look, make the best deal possible you can for Sukarno, because I want the money to go to him so he can help his people out of poverty. I want you to start at 60-40 in his favor, be ready to go down to 50-50 even split." All right. Well, do you know what the contract that Suharto signed with Freeport Sulphur was for 5%, and it went to him.
Oh my.
Okay. So this is what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, it's a continuation of this whole rotten kind of corporate international edifice that basically continued. And of course, I think it's history repeats itself. Once Trump was taken out of office, it's now continuing as well with this kind of corrupt internationalist, corporatist game. Anyways, James, um, great talk today. You're one of the nation's leading experts on the Kennedy assassination and all things related. So let's stay in touch, and I'd like to keep up with your research going forward.
Okay. My pleasure.
All right. James Eugenio, he wrote the afterword to the book JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia, available at Skyhorse Publishing. James, take care. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Have a good day.